July 12, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. High noon beneath an endless prairie sky, the heat shimmers and waves across the flat horizon. Cicadas drone in the cottonwood trees lining the camp perimeter. Inside the wire, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber sits on a wooden bench outside his barracks, shirt unbuttoned, face tilted toward the sun. 3 weeks ago, he was crouched in a hedgerow in Normandy, covered in mud and blood, firing his Mauser until the barrel burned his hands. 2 weeks ago, he was in the hold of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, convinced he was being taken to his execution. 1 week ago, he arrived here, to this place the Americans call a prisoner of war camp. And he has not stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. The barracks are clean. The latrines have running water. The guards are not brutal. There is food, actual food. And yesterday something happened that Klaus still cannot reconcile with everything he knows about war, about captivity, about the enemy. Yesterday an American soldier handed him ice cream, a full bowl of it. Cold, sweet, and possibly rich. He ate it slowly, terrified it might be his last meal. It was not. This morning, there was more food, and after the meal, the guards told him he could spend the afternoon however he wished. Reading, playing cards, resting. He sits now in the Kansas sun, ice cream digesting in his belly, and tries to understand what kind of prison gives a man ice cream and free time, the kind built by a nation that never knew hunger. When the first large groups of German prisoners began arriving in the United States in 1943, captured in North Africa, Sicily, and later Normandy, American military planners faced an unprecedented logistical challenge. By war's end, over 370,000 German POW would be housed in camps scattered across the American heartland. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be treated humanely, given adequate food and shelter, allowed to work for wages. But the reality of American POW camps exceeded those requirements so dramatically that German prisoners initially believed it was elaborate psychological warfare. Surely the abundance was temporary. Surely the kindness was a trick. Surely once their usefulness expired, the mask would drop and the real captivity would begin. They waited for the cruelty. It never came. Instead, there was ice cream. For most German soldiers, especially those who had fought on the Eastern Front or endured the final years of the war when supply lines collapsed, food had become an obsession. Rations dwindled. Bread was adulterated with sawdust. Meat was a distant memory. The Wehrmacht marched on ersatz coffee and willpower. Hunger was constant, gnawing, inescapable. And then they arrived in America, a nation so wealthy, so absurdly productive, that even its prisoners ate better than German civilians. Camp Concordia's mess hall served meals that would have been luxurious in Berlin. Roast beef, potatoes with butter, fresh vegetables, white bread, and dessert. Always dessert. Cookies, pie, and ice cream. That peculiar American extravagance, that frivolous indulgence that somehow appeared even in the middle of a global war. German POW who had not tasted sugar in months found themselves eating chocolate ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon because the camp kitchen had extra milk and cream. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Klaus Weber had expected Dachau. He had expected what he knew the SS camps were, though he would never speak of them, never acknowledge them, even to himself. He had expected retribution. The Americans had every reason to hate him. He had fought against them. He had killed their soldiers. He wore the uniform of a regime that had set the world on fire, and yet here in this Kansas camp, the guards treated him not as a monster but as a man. They were not warm exactly, not friendly, but they were fair. They followed rules. When a guard struck a prisoner at Camp Concordia, he was reprimanded. When prisoners filed complaints about conditions, those complaints were investigated. There was a library, a theater where POW staged plays, sports leagues, educational classes. Men who had spent years in the machinery of total war suddenly found themselves with something they had almost forgotten: time. Unstructured, undemanded time. Hours in which they were not required to march, to dig, to fight, to die. They could read. They could think. They could remember what it felt like to be human. The transformation was not immediate. Trust, once shattered, does not return easily. Many prisoners remained convinced the Americans were softening them for propaganda purposes. Some refused to participate in camp activities, viewing cooperation as betrayal. Others clung to Nazi ideology, holding secret meetings, enforcing loyalty through intimidation. But slowly, inexorably, the reality of American abundance began to erode the certainty that had sustained them. The ice cream was not a trick. The free time was not a trap. The food kept coming. The guards remained professional. And gradually, the prisoners began to compare what they had been told about America, weak, decadent, culturally bankrupt, with what they experienced. The contradiction could not be ignored. In letters home, monitored by censors but largely uncensored, German POW wrote with astonishment about their conditions. One prisoner in Texas described eating so much that he had gained 20 pounds. Another in Colorado marveled at the waste. The Americans threw away more food than his family in Hamburg had seen in months. A third, interned in Louisiana, wrote about attending a camp concert where the orchestra was composed entirely of prisoners playing instruments provided by the Red Cross. These letters, filtered back to Germany through neutral countries and prisoner exchanges, began to tell a story the Nazi propaganda machine could not suppress. America was not starving. America was not weak. America had so much that even its enemies were fat. The ice cream became a symbol, small, mundane, devastating in its implications. It represented surplus. It represented a nation so wealthy, so productive, that luxury extended even to captivity. German soldiers had been told they were fighting for survival, for living space, for resources their homeland lacked. And then they sat in a Kansas summer eating vanilla ice cream and realized their leaders had sent them to war against a country that produced more in peacetime than Germany could produce in total war. The ideological foundation cracked. If America was so weak, why was he eating better as a prisoner than he ever had as a soldier? If the Allies were starving and desperate, why was there ice cream? By the time the war ended in May 1945, thousands of German POW in American camps faced a choice. Return to a destroyed Germany occupied and divided, where cities were rubble and food was scarce, or remain in the United States, where some were offered agricultural work contracts, where they had seen a functioning society, where ice cream was not a miracle but a Thursday. Many chose to return. Loyalty, family, and identity pulled them home. But thousands of others, after serving their time, after the camps closed, applied for immigration. They remembered the ice cream. They remembered the free time. They remembered being treated not as subhuman, but as prisoners of war entitled to dignity under international law. They had expected vengeance. They received abundance. Klaus Weber would return to Germany in 1946. He would find his hometown bombed, his family scattered, his country divided. He would spend the rest of his life rebuilding, working, surviving. But until his death in 1989, he kept a small photograph taken at Camp Concordia, a group of prisoners sitting in the summer sun, smiling, holding bowls of ice cream. He never forgot that moment, never forgot the cognitive dissonance. Never forgot that the enemy he had been taught to despise had fed him better than his own leaders ever had. The ice cream was not kindness. It was not mercy. It was simply the baseline of American abundance applied without malice. The free time was not a gift. It was the product of a legal system that honored treaties even when vengeance would have been easier. And in that gap, between expectation and reality, between propaganda and experience, something shifted. The German POW arrived as soldiers of the Reich. They left as men who had seen what a free, productive society looked like from the inside. Some rejected it, some clung to old hatreds. But many carried home a quiet truth that no amount of propaganda could erase. They had been wrong about America, about abundance, about what kind of nation builds prison camps with ice cream and free time. War is decided by steel and fire, by blood and will. But ideas are decided by experience. And the experience of German POW in American camps was a kind of ideological warfare more devastating than any bomb. They had laughed at American softness. They had mocked American decadence. And then they ate the ice cream, and the laughter died. Because you cannot mock a nation that defeats you, captures you, and still has enough left over to give you dessert.